This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Views expressed by hosts, guests, or employees are their own and do not necessarily represent ATS or its affiliates. Mention of any company, product, or service is not an endorsement. While ATS and its sister companies share corporate ties, they operate independently. ATS is not responsible for the accuracy or content statements made. For questions, visit atsinc.com.
Welcome to Beyond the Road, an ATS podcast. I am your host, Justin, and we have a very special episode here today talking about tariffs and everything about them. We have some guests with some extensive knowledge dealing with tariffs and some understanding of it that are going to help demystify a little bit for hopefully everybody out there exactly what they are, what's the impact, what to expect when tariffs do go into effect, and what it kind of looks like on the transportation landscape. So we have Jay and AJ here. Do you guys want to give a quick intro about your name, who you are, what you do?
Sure. I'm Jay Thomason. I'm Vice President of Commercial Services for our international division, ATS International.
AJ Miller, I'm the VP of Finance here at ATS.
Okay, perfect. So we got people both on the money side and international shipping side. So should cover everything we want to cover regarding tariffs. Who wants to start? What exactly are tariffs? Can somebody just give a quick, overview, macro, 60,000 foot view on it?
Tariff is, the way I think about a tariff is it's a tax on an entry of a good. So it's much like a point of sale tax at the register that somebody would pay. An importer of goods into a country has to pay a port of entry or point of entry tax, much like that sales tax. It's an entry tax. And it's the importer of the goods that pays that tax.
So who is the importer of the goods? Traditionally in a standard transaction?
Well, in a standard transaction, it would be within the country of receipt. So as an example, when Apple makes an iPhone in China and imports that iPhone to sell in the U.S., Apple is the importer of record, what we know as the IOR. They're the importer of record, and thus that tariff that is assessed to them by the U.S. government, by the U.S. Customs Service, is payable to the U.S. government by the importer of record, Apple in this case. And those monies would go into the U.S. Treasury. And so just like if we had a federal sales tax or you have a state sales tax, it goes into the state coffers. It's going into the coffers of the U.S. Treasury.
So it is paid by the importer, but it's traditionally driven by where that's being manufactured or sent from, correct? Or incorrect?
There's a lot of different ways a tariff can be structured. A tariff can be structured on a specific commodity. In this case, it would be an iPhone. So it could be assessed on a specific, in the world of international, we call it a harmonized code or an HS code. So, black socks to the knee has a harmonized code. Black socks to the ankle has a different harmonized code. There's the HS code of the U.S. Customs Service. And that HS code, there could be a tariff on that specific code, or it can be a blanket assessment of everything coming in from a specific country.
Yeah, and I think, Jay, something interested to hear your take on too there is when we talk about that process where you might have a specific code versus that maybe more blanket or universal approach. And just to your iPhone example, let's say that the tariff is on a specific good or part within that iPhone, right? So how does that process work? So you're talking about that harmonized code, and it's not the iPhone, let's say, but it's the microchip within the iPhone that becomes the tariff. So maybe just what's your take with that?
And so a tariff can be, they can be very complicated. The tariff can be, on let's instead of an iPhone, let's switch to a vehicle. It could be on a certain component or an engine part of that vehicle. And so the tariff will be assessed just on that, maybe that microchip within that vehicle that has an HS code that a tariff has been assessed on. So yes, it could be structured in so many different ways. They can become very complicated, and and that's what creates a lot of uncertainty within the economy whenever a tariff is assessed.
Right. Yeah, and I think what's interesting for me or for my chair, right, we have a lot of conversations around the tariff idea, and that, even what you're mentioning, there can be percentages that go to the tariff. And so if I just, car or iPhone, right, if there's let's say 10% tariff out on a transmission to a car, well, I might not see a 10% increase in an automobile, right? And
Correct.
so, as you start to just try and unpack that landscape and really see that from a consumer standpoint, it might not be as specific as saying, well, a 10% tariff on parts to my car means that I have a 10% increase on the price of my car, right?
Sure, that 10% tariff on that transmission might lead to be 2% increase in the total cost of the car.
Once you look at all the other components and everything added up.
Exactly.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, so the United States isn't the only country that has tariffs, right? Is that, or some version
not.
of a tax for importing, right? What is the conventional logic as far as when and why are tariffs put in place in the first place? I'm sure there's a multitude of reasons, and hopefully you guys can unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are certainly a few reasons that come to mind, and I think a big part of that is, you see economic leverage being one idea, right? And so the idea behind trying to utilize that as a way for some country to maybe provide that leverage internally for a few different reasons, right? And,
Can you give any examples of that?
Yeah, so I think one historically that we've seen is if a country is driving down the price of a good to an unsustainable level, so like steel is an example. It happened with steel in the past where steel prices really got historically low, and so U.S. manufacturing of steel became almost unsustainable, right? And so a way or an example of how you could make that maybe more palatable is ultimately to have a tariff on imported goods for steel to help artificially make the market more competitive. But you do start to run the risk, right? As you get down those things and you start talking about, we do have a fairly global or free market economy, and so you do start talking a little bit deeper into the economics or the supply and demand components to that, which becomes a bit of a laundry list conversation of if this happens, then this is the outcome, right? But you can start making your way into, well, how do we balance this with demand and make sure that the price is comparative for both sides of this?
Yeah, and 100%. And tariffs have always been used to level market playing fields, and usually surgically. One example that I always tend to use is a certain country can subsidize the manufacturing, in this case steel, but they can subsidize the manufacturing of a certain product. For instance, solar panels. That's been a big one within the global. China, as a government, subsidized the manufacturers and the cost of manufacturing solar panels in China. And they kind of started owning the global market for solar panels. Because of that subsidy that was paid on the manufacturing cost, it really prevented the U.S. manufacturers and really all other manufacturers from being competitive within that market. So the U.S. issued a tariff specifically on Chinese subsidized solar panels being imported into the U.S., and that leveled the playing field for the U.S. manufacturing base. So the tariffs have always had a place in international trade and international markets, but normally they're done very surgically.
And I think one more piece to that comes to mind, right, is as you mentioned your example there, and not necessarily always the case, right, but it can be a retaliatory measure too, right?
Just gonna ask that.
And so it really drives to the idea of, well, if I get or receive a tariff from you when I'm trying to import a good, I might take exception to that, right? And so my country is going to find something that you might provide us and have that similar effect, right? And just
Absolutely
continues on that economic leverage standpoint, right?
And then you have a trade war.
Then you have a trade war.
Yes, then you get down a slippery slope, right?
And
Yep.
One thing I'm a firm believer in, and I think most economists and researchers would agree with me, is no one wins a trade war. Eventually, everyone in that loses, and usually the biggest losers of a trade war, and really any tariff-imposed action, is the end consumer, who bears the brunt. They're not able to pass on that tariff like the importer of record can pass it on to their wholesaler, and the wholesaler can pass it on to their retailer. The bottom of the totem pole is the consumer, and normally those tariffs are passed on to the bottom of that totem pole.
When was the last time we were engaged in a full-scale trade war?
Ooh, I don't keep up with it enough to know. They're with a full-scale trade war, as you said, and I don't know what exactly the definition of that would be.
But definition. But.
Yeah, exactly. But there's been throughout history there has been levies of tariffs, and then retaliatory tariffs, and retaliatory tariffs on top of retaliatory tariffs, and usually through negotiation and diplomacy, those issues are worked out. You mentioned there's other ways to impose closing a market to outside forces. It could be done through a monetary tariff, or subsidizing a commodity that is manufactured within your own country. But it can also be done through regulatory restrictions. And a lot of times a tariff will be imposed to combat a regulatory restriction that can't be met. In Europe, there's a lot of environmental regulatory mandates that U.S. auto manufacturers can't adhere to. And so they close that market to competition from the U.S. auto manufacturers, not because they've imposed a tariff on the import of those vehicles, but because they put regulatory restrictions in that effectively do the same thing.
So then you might see a counter tariff affecting imports of foreign vehicles into the United States, for example.
Yeah, if I haven't expressed my personal opinion yet, I'm not a fan of tariffs.
Sure.
I'm not a fan of tariffs because I'm a fan of international trade. I'm in international trade business. Tariffs are not good for international trade. So they don't promote international trade. They very much do the opposite.
And just maybe help me understand, since you are on that international side, what does that mean for, I think I've seen or heard things out there about changing in shipping routes and potential increased times in border crossings for goods because there's more scrutiny needed to understand with all the harmonized codes, right? So from an international perspective and what you see, how do tariffs relate to the international shipping of goods?
Tariffs create uncertainty, especially when they're initially being imposed. As they create uncertainty, it leads to a lot of different activity on the part of shippers and purchasers and importers and exporters in how they deal with what the potential of that tariff is going to be. And until they have a good understanding and a good picture of how that's going to affect their specific business, their specific commodity, they'll do things like front load, where they'll try and beat the implementation of that tariff and the implementation date, and they'll ship and build inventory on that and on that import before the tariff comes into effect. That artificially kind of takes up vessel capacity, truck capacity within the supply chain.
Making rates rise.
Making rates artificially rise,
Yep.
For a short time span.
Right.
And then, after the tariff, they've front loaded, so volume drops, substantially and precipitously. And so then now, shippers and vessel owners and truck carriers, now they're all scrambling with overcapacity and under demand.
Yeah. Sure.
And so again, that leads to artificially deflated rates. So it just creates a lot of uncertainty within the supply chain overall.
Sounds like volatility too.
Very much.
So we've touched on a couple points with the car example and, trade wars, you touched on it briefly, but, ultimately when it comes to paying for the tariffs, obviously the importer's not just going to eat all that. Is there any kind of, and I'm sure it varies drastically by the commodity itself and the level of the tariff, but is there any kind of just general conventional wisdom as far as like how much the consumer eats, of that tariff? Like what percent of it? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? Is there anything like that out there? Any kind of data out there to support feedback on that?
Yeah, I unfortunately probably have to defer to the it depends answer, right? And I think there are a lot of factors that go into that, right? And so you could maybe hone in on specific items as you work through that. But, as I think about just back to some of, like you said, the examples that we have, and we just kind of further into that from the overarching economic standpoint, right? Well, a tariff can increase the price of the import good. I always like to think of maybe a simpler example for me. And so I'm going to make my way to an avocado this time, right? And so we grow avocados in California. We import
a lot of avocados.
We do from Mexico, right?
Yes,
and so
love avocados, by the way.
Yeah, likewise. Great for the Super Bowl, right?
Absolutely. Love my guacamole.
Yeah,
that's good to know. Good to know.
Ultimately, right? So we have two sources. We have a domestic source and we have a foreign source, right? And so if there's a tariff on the foreign source of that good, and it drives the price up, and so I go from paying $1 for an avocado to, let's say, $1.50 for an avocado. Me as a consumer, depending on the elasticity of that good and how much people are willing to pay, for that good, you might see where you reach a point on that price that it's actually pricing out customers, right? And so, what I'll say is generally there, you might see some of that cost passed on to the end consumer, but there's only so much that the end consumer is really willing to take on of that overarching cost. And then you start running the risk, whether it's the imported good or the domestic good, where you get to a price point that you just don't have a customer base like you normally would.
You're depleting demand then.
Exactly right. And so as you talk about that supply and demand scale, right, the tariff impacts it, but also you can't forget about where that demand sits, whether you artificially inflate or deflate it with potential tariffs.
And further on that, that's a great example. So you have a foreign Mexico producer of avocados. The majority of our avocados in the U.S. come from Mexico. I don't know what that number is, but it's probably more than 75 or 80% of avocados sold in the U.S. are coming from Mexico specifically. Mm-hmm. There is domestic farmers and producers of avocados in the U.S., and they're probably doing that, making up that other 15 or 20%, whatever that number is. When the price of that imported, because you've put a tariff on that avocado, and it goes from $1 to $1.50, over time, the longer that tariff is in effect, allows the domestic producer to raise their price artificially. So now they don't have to sell their avocado for $1 anymore. They could sell it for $1.40 and still be under competition. But it's raised the price of avocados
40%,
domestically produced and internationally produced, or foreign produced, I should say. So again, there's a reason that tariffs are usually very surgically put into place. And tactfully, because as a blanket, when tariffs are over time, it raises the price on all goods, and much artificially for the consumer. That's who's paying, ultimately is going to pay the majority. You asked for what's the percentage. I don't know what the percentage is. As AJ, as you said, it depends. Mm-hmm. But I do know the majority of that tariff is going to get passed to the lowest common denominator, the consumer.
That makes sense. So you talked about front loading, and you talked about some of the volume depletion when those cycles, kind of get to the other side of it. What other impacts do you see on just transportation as a whole with tariff talk? Is it just more? I know, on the open deck side, we saw a lot of that front loading activity earlier part of this year. And, there's a lot of uncertainty where there's just a lot of waiting to see what was going to happen, and it kind of stalled some projects out or some opportunities out while they're kind of waiting to see what happened. Obviously, that affects their bottom line too. They're not recognizing revenue if they're not producing it and delivering it. And that's obviously lost opportunity for them as well. But what else? Is there anything else that you've seen specific to transportation that you expect to see play out, or you've seen play out as these talks are kind of up in the air and people are trying to see where everything's going to land?
Whenever tariffs talk gets into the market, we talked about it already, uncertainty. That's in a single word, what it creates in the supply chain is uncertainty. Uncertainty is not good in any domestic or economic economy. Because not only it causes uncertainty, not only with the consumer who doesn't know what they're going to have to pay for that avocado, but it causes uncertainty for the producers, for the exporters, for the importers, for the transportation service providers. Really, just entirely down the from the manufacturing to the end consumer. The uncertainty is what kind of drives, people to retract, hold off. Yeah. Once the front loading is done, and that initial reaction of a tariff is going to be put in place. So, I'm going to buy as much as I can now and get in before the tariff takes effect. Once that wears off, which is pretty quickly, then everybody kind of takes a wait and see approach. Okay, let's see if this tariff is going to stick. Let's see if they're going to keep, implementing and applying this tariff, or let's see if diplomatic discussions and negotiations, alleviate it. So then the next reaction is normally, let's hold off. Let's put a project on hold. Let's wait 30 days. Let's see if anything develops before we have to outlay this money. Because once the tariff, nobody gets a refund on a tariff.
Right.
The tariffs are never retroactively retracted, back to those people that paid it. So the next reaction after front loading is wait and see. And then once that period is over, and if it's going to stick, then you get to that period where can I buy elsewhere? But it's years and years before major decisions are made and investments are made to move manufacturing and build new plants. And, that's years and years down the road before those investments are made, that because of this tariff, I'm not going to manufacture in country A. I'm going to move my entire production into my market in country B. Those just are not quick decisions.
Yeah, and I'm sure just, when you're looking at like geopolitics and everything, you never know kind of who we're going to be allies with, who we're going to be, kind of at each other's throat with at any point in time. So you want to have some firm level of certainty that wherever you decide to build it, there's not going to be some pivot, or wherever it's at now that you're thinking of moving it from, that's not going to come back into better graces.
Well, through the period of time in 2016, 2017, when the initial blanket China tariffs were put into place, there has been a lot of manufacturing that, because of COVID, not only because of tariffs, but because of COVID, they've done nearshoring and bring that closer, that manufacturing closer to the U.S. market in particular.
And a lot of that was tied to just, supply and demand and container space or vessel space. And
it was tied to a lot of things. So there has been a lot of that manufacturing that was in China has moved to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And, then the next wave that comes to those manufacturers that made those investments to move to Mexico, now there's the potential, or then the next, what was discussed was, now we're going to put tariffs on Mexico products. And so now those manufacturers are, what am I to do next? And again, build in America and build in the U.S. if you, getting back to an iPhone, you can't manufacture that iPhone in the U.S. and still sell it for the same price that it was being manufactured in China. And you can offset with the tariff, but the consumer's still going to pay more for that iPhone.
Sure. Just wages and everything.
Yeah, just for the value of that iPhone. I mean, if that iPhone was $700 coming out of China, and you put a $50 tariff on it, it's now costing $750. But to manufacture it and retail it in the U.S., it's going to cost $900 or $1,000. It's gonna be more than what it was to manufacture it in China or Mexico or anywhere else where you have depressed labor cost, and think that you can bring it in, that manufacturing, into the U.S. and keep the price the same as that lower labor cost that you had in that other depressed market. So a lot of uncertainty. Yeah, in a word, getting back to our single word, right? A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
All right, so auto tariffs. If there's any tariffs on components going into automobiles or anything tied to that, AJ, on the semi-truck side, does that correlate there at all? Are there any similar parts, components, any tariffs that you're keeping an eye on tied to that might impact the cost of a semi-truck or anything for the carriers out there that might be listening?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we're starting to see is back to the uncertainty, right? But some level of that uncertainty that really is almost driving a potential for increased costs associated with back to our actual automobile example, right? If there are specific parts,
components,
and yes, that are made in areas that might have an effect from tariffs, right? You might start seeing some surcharges that would be similar to the COVID era, right, when we had supply chain issues,
semiconductor issues.
Yep. So different layout, right? But not something I'm projecting, but something that could happen out of it, right? You might start seeing that piecemeal component that would increase costs, and I think, as you kind of unpack that a little bit further, if you see an increased cost at that new product, that new truck, you might see the same if you're repairing, right? So if you have repair parts that you need,
sure.
Depending on where they're manufactured, right? Yep. Which also then you start talking about even the used market, and you're going to start to potentially then see a similar effect. Well,
the avocado example.
Yeah, right.
You're going to see a gap where
right.
you can start to raise it domestically.
Yeah. So if you have a raised new cost on some sort of new vehicle, right, you might have that same cost getting then passed down to the used market because you have more consumers who are maybe holding off on that new purchase of the brand new vehicle, and really thinking back to, okay, well, right now a better fit for me is still a used truck, right, or some sort of used vehicle that fits better. Well, that demand is now shifted from new to used. Well, you might see then an increase in that used pricing associated with it. And
like we saw during COVID when all the used prices went through the roof.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
Different reasons, different place,
right.
but kind of potential to get back to the same route.
That was the gap was really narrow between a 5-year-old vehicle and a new vehicle at that point in time.
Right.
If it was under certain mileage.
Yeah. Well, and because tariffs do have an effect of limiting competition.
Yeah. Yep.
In any market. So if that imported product is now going to cost more, it allows the domestic manufactured product to eventually raise their prices.
Right. Yep.
To a level that's closer to and still could be below the tariffed product.
Mm-hmm.
But they now have a gap because they don't have to compete against a lower cost product that didn't have that tariff. So, and when we talk about Class 1 trucks in particular, some of the Class 1 manufacturers here are assembling or manufacturing in Mexico today.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be mistaken. Is it Freightliner that is doing their majority of their assembly and manufacturing in Mexico now? So, and many of the other ones, if I'm not mistaken, the components are foreign.
Yeah.
And they're coming in assembling here, but that a lot of those components are foreign, and those components can have tariff on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So again, it limits competition, and limiting competition is not good for the consumer. Competition makes manufacturers and makes producers better when they have to compete with each other.
Yeah, and I think it brings it back for me, if I kind of round this out at the very back end of that, and we talk about potentially then higher prices on new, potentially higher prices on used, and we kind of start circling back into the idea of the transportation industry with trucks. Well, what does that do for truck capacity, right? And so very much an uncertainty item, but does that drive the cost higher where somebody who maybe was struggling to consider even a used vehicle just with everything they're working through, does it just make it that much harder to get even into a new used vehicle for them? So it just really brings that question to me of, as we talk capacity, is that another layer, another struggle that some of the carriers might have? Yeah,
it's been a rocky road the last couple of years for the carrier side. So hopefully those are pretty minimal impacts. But I guess, like you said, just a period of uncertainty, just like everybody else, just kind of waiting and seeing.
There's that word again.
Right.
It's the theme
word
of the episode.
It is the word of the day.
Right.
Word of the moment.
Yeah, if you're a U.S. importer, what can you do to protect your supply chains right now? Is there anything? Any suggestions?
Stay vigilant to what's happening in the markets and what's happening with tariffs. I mean, that's kind of the number one. Stay nimble. Be ready to shift suppliers, shift sources in your supply chain. Have backup sources of supply chain. In a nutshell, stay involved, stay connected.
Don't put your head in a hole.
No, and as much as you want to wait and see, and that's you need to do that, but be ready to make decisive decision when the time comes as well. And that comes with, staying vigilant and understanding what the situation is.
So how would one stay on top of that, these ever-changing conversations? How do you stay informed?
I feel like, Jay, maybe a little different here, but I'd kind of circle back to it with you on it. But it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is the bottom line of that is communication, right? So having lines of communication, both, when I think vertically, right, but above and below you as far as the supply chain goes. Are you guys seeing a lot of communication efforts from different individuals that are looking for transportation-related capacity items kind of in this realm?
Yeah, especially, when it comes to international, obviously, and that's who's most affected, obviously, with tariffs, importers, exporters. Whenever tariff talk starts happening, especially when it's broad-reaching tariff talk, not strategic, specific commodities, one or two HS codes, but when it's broader on a whole country or a percentage of a commodity that comes in. When that happens, we start getting a lot more questions from those importers and exporters on and looking for as much information as they can get on is this tariff real? Is it going to happen?
Yeah.
When does it happen? When does it take effect? How long could it potentially be in effect? It creates just a myriad of questions on the part of everyone, which is all born from our word of the day, uncertainty.
Uncertainty,
and,
absolutely.
People want certainty in their business. People want certainty in the economy. And when you don't have that, it causes a lot of disruption.
Well, that feels a little rocky, but any specific takeaways you want people to walk away from this episode with, other than just uncertainty?
Here's what I would say. You're not alone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're not alone. We don't have all the answers. I think that
right.
we'd be the first to say we don't have all the answers when it comes to tariff and the implications of tariffs and what you should do about a tariff, because they can be so varied. And so specific to a manufacturing base or a specific product, right? So it's hard to have, the answers for every scenario that you can think of when it comes to a tariff. But my takeaway would be that your uncertainty that you're feeling in your business is the same uncertainty that everyone else is feeling in theirs. So you're not alone. That would be my best takeaway is that don't feel alone.
Okay. Well, it was a very informative episode. Appreciate both your guys' time. Learned a lot. Hopefully the audience did too. Please, if you liked what you heard, check out the Learning Hub at atsinc.com, our business-to-business YouTube channel on it's called Anderson Trucking Service, and our driver YouTube channel called Over the Road. Thanks for tuning in. Be safe out there, and thank you both again for your time here today.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks, everyone.